my grandfather would come to regret his decision to put down the hound. At first he had thought that the beast was sick, or feral, or succumbing to the ravages of age. It was only with hindsight that he realized that the hound was trying to protect him. In his haste, he had killed his closest friend and companion. It was then that my grandfather learned, beware most of all the benevolent sins. Today we're going to talk about crafting your campaign as a dungeon master on this episode of the Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I'm a storyteller and it is my job to spend hours every week actively plotting your demise. Welcome to my channel where we talk about role-playing games like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we are starting a new series for this channel that I'm calling Crafting Your Campaign. I have spent a lot of time talking to gamers who are interested in the art of storytelling. They want to run their first game or run their first campaign, and while they're interested in getting started as a dungeon master, it seems overwhelming to actually craft a campaign. It seems overwhelming to try to build that large and that expansive of a story. So what I thought I would do with this channel is I would take some time and talk about the subject of how a dungeon master actually crafts their campaign. I'm going to talk about the process that I use in crafting campaigns, and I'm going to talk about several of the individual pieces that you want to think about when you are putting together a story as a dungeon master. But I am very excited to announce that for this series, I'm not actually going to be working alone. I have a partner who is going to be helping me out with this series. We have a remarkable guest star who is going to be joining me later on in this series to help talk about some of the elements that go into planning a campaign. I'm not going to spoil who that guest is yet, but I am looking forward to their contribution and them being a part of this particular conversation. But this is the introductory video to this series. My goal here is to give you kind of a big picture view of what it is to be a storyteller, to be a dungeon master, and to craft that first campaign. So this series is aimed at any player who has considered sitting on the other side of that storyteller screen. I'm going to walk you through some of the steps I take when I am writing out a campaign, and hopefully I can inspire you to take your first shot at storytelling as well. So please join me as we talk about crafting your campaign. So what can you expect from this video? Well, first I'm going to talk about some big ideas that you should be aware of if you are considering becoming a storyteller. These are concepts that have really helped me as a storyteller, and I think they will be beneficial for you as you take your first steps into the fine art of storytelling. After that, I'm going to talk about some of the individual pieces that a storyteller needs to think about if they want to craft a good story. We're not going to deep dive those pieces in this video. I'm actually going to be devoting a separate video to each of those pieces, but I want to go ahead and highlight some of the important topics that are going to be a part of this series. After that, I'm going to answer a very specific question. What is the bare minimum that you need to meet in order to start your first campaign? We're actually going to talk about the bare minimum that you need to do if you want to get started. Then we're going to take it a step farther, and I'm going to talk about my recommended level of preparation before you truly begin a campaign. We're going to have a bare minimum, and then we're going to kick it up a notch to what I think is a healthy recommendation if you want to be well established when you get going. And then we're going to take an example of a campaign that I wrote a few years ago called Benevolent Sins, and I'm going to talk about how some of those steps applied to that campaign. So let's get going. What are the big ideas that I think every starting dungeon master needs to know? Well, number one, you don't have to be perfect. Let me just say this, let me just put this out there. You do not have to be a perfect storyteller. You do not have to be a Matthew Mercer. You do not have to be a Mark Adkins. You do not have to be whatever storyteller you sat under. A lot of people put this giant level of responsibility on the term dungeon master or storyteller, and let me just say, that is not expected. It is okay to be a new storyteller, and it is okay to take small steps in getting started as a storyteller. You don't have to be perfect. Number two, I would like you to know, you don't have to write a full campaign to get started as a storyteller. These 6 books represent the Age of Ashes campaign for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. This was the first campaign that Paizo released to go along with Pathfinder 2nd Edition. You can see here it's 6 books, and this is a full campaign that is intended to take players all the way from level 1 to level 20. It has all of the encounters, all of the treasure, all of the locations. It's got all of the big ideas. It's got a number of really in-depth role-playing scenarios. And let me just say, you don't have to do all of this. You don't need all of this work to get started. Do I appreciate the fact that Paizo gave me this much information for the campaign I'm currently running? Yes, I do. But trust me when I say, as a storyteller, this is not the mark you're trying to hit. In fact, when we look at products like that, it's really easy to hold that up as an ideal of what we're supposed to be doing as storytellers. And in my experience, the vast majority of campaigns don't look like that. Don't get me wrong, I love what Paizo did there, but most campaigns are not that clean. Most campaigns are not that well put together. In fact, this is the big idea of this entire video. The majority of campaigns are this weird piecing together of a puzzle that you don't even know what the puzzle is supposed to look like when you get started. I want you to imagine for a moment taking an old box of puzzle pieces, and there's no picture on the box, okay? You just have this cardboard box full of pieces, and you dump it out on the table, and you begin to try and piece together what this puzzle is supposed to be. That process is the closest analogy that I can think of to what the art of storytelling truly looks like. As you take pieces and move them around and rearrange them and spin them around, you begin to find connections, and slowly the picture begins to take shape, and you may not even know what that picture is going to be until you get halfway or more through the process of assembling the puzzle. So if you're thinking about storytelling, let me encourage you. Think about storytelling through the lens of assembling a puzzle. You see different pieces of a story that are floating out there, and you don't know how they're going to connect, and you start playing with them and moving them around to determine what the final picture is going to become. So if we want to use assembling a puzzle as our allegory for storytelling, that begs the question, what are the important pieces that we need to think about as we try to assemble our campaign? Now, presently, I have 6 topics that I am planning on talking about as part of this series, and we're going to touch on them briefly here. But I plan to do individual videos on each of these topics. However, if there are other topics that you would like me to include as part of this series, go ahead and throw those down in the comments, and I will make a serious effort to add it into the schedule for this series. However, for now, the 6 pieces that I want to talk about that we're going to be trying to assemble include some classic pieces like villains. Who is our big bad going to be? Who are some of the other villains that our players are going to encounter in the course of the story? Locations. Where are our players going to go? What is the setting, the backdrop for this particular campaign and this series of adventures? MacGuffins. Sorry, I mean treasure. What are some of the motivators and rewards in this particular story? Outside of your basic pieces, you also have some more complicated pieces that you get to wrestle around with. One of them is player characters and player character backstory. This piece is the reason that a storyteller can never write an entire campaign before the first session begins. If you want to write a good campaign, you have to include your player characters in that campaign. And so we're going to talk a little bit in this series about wrestling with that piece of PCs and PC backgrounds. Some other more nebulous but important pieces to consider are your campaign's theme and style. Style is going to refer to things like horror, high fantasy, adventure, pirates, I don't know. Style is any kind of broad descriptor that you plan on using for your campaign. And theme is a question of what are the big ideas, the important lessons that your campaign is going to wrestle with. The final piece that I want to include here is a pair of, I guess we'll call them markers. Your first adventure and your campaign finale. As a storyteller, you're going to need to think about where your story begins, what brings the players together and sets this whole thing rolling. And you also want to think about your campaign finale, where you plan on the story ending up, what the final moments of the campaign might look like. Now, these are very, very brief descriptions of those pieces. As I said, as part of this series, we're going to do some deep dives on every single one of those. But as a storyteller, what you're going to do is you're going to take these different pieces and they're going to be rolling around inside your mind, and you're going to be asking, okay, this appeals to me, but how can I connect it to that? Maybe you have an idea for an incredible villain. Or maybe there's a particular location in an RPG setting that just calls to you. Or maybe you've always wanted to wrestle with a particular moral dilemma as part of a story. As a storyteller, what you're going to find is you'll have all of these different pieces just kind of bouncing around inside your head. And the key to crafting an excellent story is taking these pieces and turning them around and trying to fit them together until a picture begins to form. And it's that art and science of piecing these different things together that will help you be successful in crafting your first campaign. Now, I've already alluded to the fact that as a storyteller, you are not going to craft an entire campaign, every single encounter, every single moment, every single character before the campaign begins. Storytellers will have different amounts of work that they do before the campaign, and from one storyteller to the next, it's going to vary how much you feel you need to have in place before you can properly begin a campaign. But really quick, I just want to ask the question, what is the bare minimum for you as a storyteller to start your next campaign? What is the absolute least amount of work that you have to do if you want to get started? Think about those pieces that I just shared. Which of those pieces are essential in order to get started? This might surprise you, but most of those pieces are not actually strictly necessary if you want to get your next campaign going. In fact, there's only one piece that is truly necessary if you want to get started. The first adventure. Literally, that's it. That's all you need. If you have your first adventure ready to go, you have everything you need to get that campaign started. Everything else that is part of that campaign, you still have time to write. In fact, some of the things that happen during the first adventure can become drivers for other events in the campaign. They can become ideas and inspiration for other things that you might want to do as a storyteller. A large part of storytelling is inventing stuff on the fly and responding to the madness that your players bring to your table. So, really and truthfully, if you have adventure number 1 ready to go, you have enough to start a campaign, because I promise you, your players are going to give you more ideas and you're going to find more to work with as you work your way through that first adventure. So really, if you want to get started as a storyteller, just let your players know, hey everyone, I have an adventure that I want to try out, and if it goes well, it might turn into a campaign, and just get started. I promise if you can do that, you can launch a successful campaign. So that was the bare minimum. If you have your first adventure, you have enough to honestly get started on your next campaign. But for me as a storyteller, I will admit I do like to do more than that before I actually begin a campaign. There is more to my writing process before I actually pull together a campaign and try to get it rolling. In fact, there are 3 pieces that I consider to be important to at least have mapped out before I will truly begin a new campaign. And those pieces are the first adventure, the campaign finale, and the campaign theme. If I have those 3 pieces reasonably in place in my mind, I have a framework that I can build on as the campaign progresses. I like to think of it this way. I want to have a first adventure that is going to hook my players and draw their characters together. I want to have a compelling event that is going to bring my party together, make them want to work together, and serve as a foundation for their friendship and for the larger adventure that they're going to have. The next thing that I want to have is a campaign finale. I want to have an idea of where this campaign is going. What is the final confrontation going to look like? What is the final dilemma going to be? What is the big crowning achievement of this campaign? Where am I taking my players? Where are they starting? Where are they going? And my third piece is the campaign theme. I don't have all of the events of my campaign written before the game begins, but I do make it a point to write out the core theme of my campaign. I usually come up with a moral question or a moral dilemma. I usually come up with a big idea that I am trying to illustrate. I select a theme for my campaign to serve as a guiding principle for the story. If you take those 3 pieces, it comes together like this. I have where my players are starting, I have where my players are going, and I have a description of how my players are going to get there. The first adventure sets them on their journey. The finale brings their journey to a compelling and wonderful close, and the theme becomes a vessel for describing how the story will develop. Every campaign I run will always have those 3 pieces in place before the campaign gets started. Now, I know that that is a little bit vague, so let me give you a concrete example of what that looked like in one of my recent campaigns. A few years ago, I began writing a campaign that I called Benevolent Sins. I actually used a quote from one of the NPCs in that campaign to open up this video. And that quote from the NPC was actually one of the very first things that I came up with when I decided to write that campaign. Beware most of all the benevolent sins. This was a random turn of phrase that just popped into my head one day, and I remember thinking, ooh, that sounds cool. I wonder if I can write a story about that. I had this weird phrase, beware most of all the benevolent sins, and I began just playing with different ideas about how I could use that phrase. In fact, one of the first questions that I had to ask myself was, what is a benevolent sin? The answer that I came up with is the person who is doing the wrong thing for the right reason. The person who is trying to help and making the situation worse. The person who is dead set on a particular course of action, even though that course is going to be nothing but disastrous. Benevolent sins are functionally the good intentions that pave a certain road to a less than desirable location. This turn of phrase gave me the idea for a campaign where the principal antagonists were going to be characters who were arguably good aligned. They were characters who were arguably noble. They were certainly very well intentioned, and they were all headed down a very, very destructive path. I began to imagine what it would look like if my players had to deal with villains that were very sympathetic but also very, very wrong, and the moral quandaries, the moral dilemmas that might come from trying to stop people who are dead set on a terrible path. In essence, the first thing that I came up with for the Benevolent Sins campaign was the theme. Of my three big pieces that I talked about earlier, the first thing I came up with in that instance was the theme. This idea of benevolent sins was going to be the guiding principle of every sub-story that I wrote in that game. So from that particularly nebulous concept, I had to start crafting out specific stories, specific villains, specific locations that I could use in order to highlight this concept that I had come up with. Now, the next thing that I wrote after coming up with my campaign theme was my campaign finale. You see, if the big idea of the campaign was benevolent sins, people who think they're doing the right thing, but they're headed down a very destructive path, the natural thing for the finale was to put my players in a situation where they didn't know if they were doing the right thing or not. I wanted to craft a scenario where my players had to question themselves and ask themselves, am I doing the right thing? Or have I latched on to a course of action that could have very dire consequences? Now, my primary game is Pathfinder, and most of my games are set in the Golarion campaign setting that Paizo publishes. So I began to look at some of the story threads that Paizo has left dangling, and one of the big ones in that setting is what happened to the god Eridan. In Golarion, there was this incredible deity named Eridan who was responsible for so many major events throughout the course of human history, and then, randomly, he disappeared. And it's one of the biggest mysteries in that entire setting. So I looked at that mystery, and I began to ask, how can I use this? And I settled upon the idea that Eridan disappeared while he was trying to prevent a group of people from doing something that had the potential to be very disastrous. Now, I won't go into all of the different pieces that I actually used for this campaign, but what I did is I actually wrote out 10 possible endings for this story. I came up with 10 potential scenarios, and I was going to let my players choose one of these 10 possible scenarios. Actually, to be more specific, I was going to give my players the option to choose one of the 10 or to refuse to choose. So there were actually 11 scenarios, but the core of my finale was going to be these 10 possibilities. In fact, it was going to be 10 deity level wish spells, and I was going to let my players pick one. But there was a catch. My players were going to be given two pieces of information that they knew for sure. One wish spell had the potential to restore Eridan to life and usher in a truly golden age of humanity. And one of the wish spells had the potential to literally destroy Golarion, reducing it to ash. Theoretically, the other 8 wish spells, while not nearly as extreme as those two, would be positive in some fashion or another. I was going to present my players with this opportunity to pick one of the 10 wishes and then ask themselves, do we really know which wish is the dangerous one? As you can tell, this was really designed to play on that benevolent sins idea. I was going to toy with my players and give them lots of different reasons to think, oh, maybe this wish is the one that can bring Eridan back to life, or maybe this wish is the good one, or maybe this wish is the destructive one. Wait, here are 2 clues that are pointing at the same wish, one saying that it's the Eridan restoring wish, and the other one saying that it's the destructive wish. Which one do we go with? I was going to put my players in a position where the very act of choosing a wish became very morally questionable. Were they choosing to engage in a benevolent sin themselves? So that is 2 of my 3 recommended targets when it comes to writing your first campaign. I had a theme, I had a finale. The next thing that I needed to craft was my first adventure. I knew where I was going, I knew how I was going to get there, but I needed to know where my players were going to start. And I'll go ahead and tell you, this is one of the areas where I have a lot of fun as a storyteller because I really love coming up with very dramatic and stressful opening scenarios. I love creating situations where a group of strangers are forced together and they are forced to work together to survive very dramatic scenarios. In a recent campaign, my players were all on board of a ship which was wrecked in a massive hurricane, and they washed up on the shore of an uncharted island, and they had to figure out where they were and how to get home. In another campaign, all of my players were visitors at a particular town when a section of that town got quarantined off because the plague had broken out and they were all stuck inside the quarantined plague zone. I love throwing out different scenarios like this. I once wrote a campaign where my players all woke up in a town with no idea how they got there or where they were. I enjoy these off the wall first adventures that bring the party together. But for this particular campaign, for Benevolent Sins, I already knew some of the pieces of the story that I was going to be playing with. I already mentioned that I was using the missing deity Eridan from the Golarion setting. Another major piece of the Golarion setting was the Pathfinder Society. In the Golarion setting, the Pathfinder Society is a group of professional explorers and adventurers who go out and try to discover interesting things in the world. For this particular campaign, I knew that I wanted to use the Pathfinder Society. It's a society that would naturally be asking the question, where did Eridan go anyways? So, my opening scenario, I immediately knew I wanted my players to be on a Pathfinder Society expedition. But from there, I had to toy around and think, how am I going to make this first adventure memorable? Well, the Pathfinder Society is the sort of society that explores old and dangerous ruins. So a natural thought from that point was cursed ruins. And I came up with the idea of characters who were at a dig site and they opened up a set of old ruins and let out a curse that was causing the area around the ruins to rapidly become flooded, forcing my players to work together to get to the heart of the ruins before the floods overwhelmed their camp, overwhelmed them, and left them all skeletons inside this ruin. So that was my opening scenario. Force my players to work together to race against the clock, to race against these rising floodwaters, to try to explore these ruins before the curse overtook them. And if you can't tell from that brief description, this tied in very well with my theme. The Pathfinder Society was there because they were trying to pursue new and interesting information. They had a benevolent purpose in exploring the ruins, but they sinned by setting off that curse. As you can tell, the theme is a very clear connection from where the party began to where I wanted the party to go. So that is a real quick example of how I assembled the pieces for one of my recent campaigns. I set the starting point, I set the finale, I set the theme, and once I had those, I had enough to work with that I could craft individual adventures throughout the course of the campaign that were being developed by the theme, being developed by the player characters and their actions, and I knew eventually I could bring my players to that finale, to that final decision I wanted them to make. But that's a lot of information for one video, so I'm going to go ahead and leave our thoughts there. Like I said, we're going to come back and we're going to look at all of the different pieces I mentioned in more detail. For some of those pieces, as I've said, we have a guest star who is going to be appearing to help talk about some of these issues. But for now, let me throw the conversation over to you. What story elements do you think a storyteller should think about when they are trying to craft a campaign? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, like it, share it, subscribe to our channel. As I've said, we've got more videos in this series coming up and a couple of other series that I am hoping to get started soon. We've got a lot of exciting things happening in this channel. Thank you for joining me and have a wonderful day. Hello everyone, this is Mark with the post-credits volunteer shoutout. As you all know, I like to take a little bit of time with every video and encourage people to get involved with volunteerism, find ways to get involved in making your community a better place and being a blessing to your neighbors, to the people around you. I believe that the world is changed by the collective weight of the small actions that we do every single day. We talk a lot about storytelling on this channel, and I would like to tell stories that aren't just about role-playing games. I would like to tell your stories as well. So if you have a story of volunteering that is meaningful to you, I would like to give you an opportunity to share that story on this channel. So if you have a story of some volunteering that you have done or an example of how volunteering has impacted you and you would like to share that on this channel, please reach out to me. I would love to give you an opportunity to share that story, to offer a real-world example of how volunteering has made a difference in your life and the lives of those around you. So if you would like to be part of the volunteer shoutout, let me know. And if you are looking for ways to get involved in your community, continue to be a part of this conversation. There are opportunities every single day to make this world a better place. Thank you for joining me and have a wonderful day.